President at the Cato Institute in Washington. His book, Libertarianism, a Primer, describes the history and central tenets of the philosophy. David Boaz appeared on Book Notes in January 1997 to discuss the book.
David Boaz, author of Libertarianism and The Libertarian Reader. Can you remember the first moment you thought that's what you'd call yourself politically?
I'm not sure I remember it exactly. It was probably when I was a high school senior, and I probably read Ayn Rand and started thinking of myself that way. It might have been when I was in college when I really thought what these ideas amount to that I'm developing here is libertarianism.
Why Ayn Rand?
Well, a lot of people read Ayn Rand when they're young. I was interested in politics. My father was involved in politics, and so he got me thinking about it. Actually, I think the first political book I read might have been The Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater, and then I read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, which is just a brilliant discussion in 100 pages or so of what economics is, what it means to think like an economist. And that got me thinking in that direction. And then when I was a senior, Ayn Rand wrote great novels. I mean, whether you were interested in the politics or not, they were fun to read. And I pulled one off the shelf, and I ended up reading it all through spring break. And that really kind of made me think about what I thought the nature of freedom was and what individual rights were supposed to be. And that put me on the course, I think.
Which one of her novels did you like the best?
Well, it's hard to say. I think Atlas Shrugged is probably the most comprehensive, the one she thought was the fullest presentation of her ideas. But a lot of people think We the Living is a more of a real novel. The characters are less political. It's more realistic. It's probably the one that was most autobiographical. But if you kind of want the political message that Ayn Rand is putting out, then I think Atlas Shrugged is the best.
Tucked in The Libertarian Reader is a name associated with Ayn Rand, Alan Greenspan.
Alan Greenspan.
Where were they ever together?
Well, Alan Greenspan became very close to Ayn Rand when he was a young man in New York, was a great admirer of her philosophy and personally close to her, and contributed one or more essays, I think, to one of the books that she edited that were mostly her essays and some other people. And I assume that he still maintains that admiration.
Did you ever meet her?
I did not know.
This got two books. It's the first time I think we've ever done two books. One's called The Libertarian Reader. What's this?
That's a collection of, really, I think the first time this has been done, a collection of all the greatest libertarian writings ever. I generally say from John Locke to Milton Friedman, but in fact there are a few before John Locke, including an excerpt from the Bible. It's one of the first indications of libertarian thought, and it does go right up to Milton Friedman and people younger than he is, Richard Epstein and some of my colleagues at the Cato Institute. All the greatest writings on libertarianism ever.
And what's this?
Libertarianism, a Primer, is an introduction to the ideas, the history of libertarianism, the way libertarianism approaches the relationship of the individual and the state, and also the way it approaches contemporary issues. It's all written by me. The other one is all written by people of much greater stature.
What's the Cato Institute?
Cato Institute is a public policy research organization that's sometimes abbreviated to think tank. We're in Washington. We'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary this spring. And it is devoted to the ideas of individual liberty, free markets, limited government, and peace.
Where'd you get the name Cato?
Well, that's a complicated story. The Institute is named for Cato's Letters, which were a series of pamphlets published in the 18th century that were very popular with the people who made the American Revolution. They were published in England, but they were classical liberal, which is ideas we would now call libertarian, essays on contemporary issues. The reason we picked that name is that we perceived that the authors of Cato's Letters were taking the ideas of philosophers like John Locke and applying them to the issues of the day. And that's what the Cato Institute does. We take the ideas of people like John Locke and Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek and apply them to issues of the day.
How big is the Cato Institute?
We have a budget of about $8 million. We have 50 staff members. We have maybe 60 scholars around the country and even a few around the world that we work with as adjunct scholars. We publish 10 books a year, 30 studies a year.
Now, I remember talking to Adam Bellow, who is the editorial director of the Free Press that published this. Why did you go to him to do this instead of publishing the books yourself?
Well, I think that the free press, being a part of Simon & Schuster, has great reach. They can reach bookstores, they reach reviewers, they can distribute books better than the Cato Institute can. And after all, I'm the senior editor at the Cato Institute, so if I'd been editing my own book, I'm sure it wouldn't have come out as well. I got some good editorial help from the free press.
When did you get the idea that you wanted these 2 volumes to come out? How long ago?
About a year and a half ago. It was actually a pretty quick schedule. The free press was very good about turning books around much quicker after the manuscript was done than usually happens. It was, I would say, in '95 that I really got interested in writing a book. If I'd done it my way, it probably would have been more of a manifesto and less of a primer. It was free press's idea that a primer was what was really needed, that people would like to read an introduction that was not just sort of my opinion about the issues of the day, but that does introduce a tradition that goes back really to the Bible and Antigone, right on through the Renaissance, the Levelers, John Locke, Adam Smith, the American Revolution, up to the present day. So there's sort of a chapter of history, and then the ideas of those people are woven throughout the book.
On the cover of both books, of course, is your name, and the person to see this for the first time would just jump in there and say that's David Boaz, but you pronounce it Boaz. How come?
Well, I have no idea. That's what my father told me to pronounce it. We are 8th generation Scotch-Irish Americans, and we claim that in Scotland we're related to all the people who spell it B-O-W-E-S. So maybe that's the reason that 200 years ago nobody could spell, and people, when people learned to spell, they wrote it down different ways.
What town were you born in?
Mayfield, Kentucky. It's almost on the Mississippi River.
What was your childhood like there?
Oh, pretty standard Leave It to Beaver childhood, I guess. Actually, I think Leave It to Beaver was set in Mayfield, although I never assumed it was Kentucky. My father was a lawyer. My mother was a homemaker. I have a younger brother and sister. We all went to college. Pretty typical childhood.
What kind of reading did you do early?
I did a lot of reading, all sorts of things. I read a lot of novels. One of my earliest passions was astronomy when I was about 6, 7 years old, and that was the beginning of the space program, and I did a lot of that reading. I'm sure I know less about astronomy now than I did when I was 7 years old, but at the time it was very important to me. When I got to high school, I was very interested in politics, and I read lots of big, thick political novels. And then I got more interested in political philosophy, and I started reading things like Henry Hazlitt and Friedrich Hayek and Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman.
Can you point to anybody that got you interested in that stuff?
Well, my father certainly. My father was very interested in politics.
Was he a politician?
He was a judge in our local community. And he was very interested in political ideas, and he talked about the role of the government. He thought the federal government was way too big, and I guess that got me thinking in that direction. And then as I started reading, I found a lot of evidence that I thought that was true, and I now probably think it's a lot more too big than he would have thought.
Why?
I think probably, well, for one thing, it's gotten a lot bigger, and we can see more of the problems than, say, we would have when my father was my age. But for another reason, I think I just perhaps read different things, thought about things differently, and decided that there was a more fundamental indictment of the size of government, that there is something about human beings that means they ought to be free to live their lives the way they want to, and that intrusion by government into that process is wrong. And that came to seem very consistent and very right to me.
Where'd you go to college?
Vanderbilt University, which is sort of the closest big, good school to Western Kentucky.
Nashville.
Right.
What'd you study?
I started out studying political science, and then I decided that I wasn't very impressed with what one studies in political science. It seemed to me they took a very interesting subject and made it pretty dry and uninteresting, so I ended up with a degree in American history, which I think is a great background for doing anything.
What'd you do after school?
I came to Washington almost immediately. I edited a magazine called New Guard, which was sort of a political magazine for young people. Then I moved to a group called the Council for a Competitive Economy, and then it wasn't very many years after college that I ended up at the Cato Institute, and I've actually been there for 15 years.
How old is Cato, by the way?
20 years.
In the back of your primer, you have a little question and answer thing, a little game that you can play to find out if you're a libertarian or not. And you have two categories, personal freedom and economic freedom. And it might be interesting to just go down the list of the questions you asked. What was the purpose of this, by the way?
Well, it's really the publisher's